Okay, I think that's everyone in. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. As we approach the end of January, I think most of us would normally have already had our holidays booked and planned and be eagerly looking forward to them. As you're about to find out, that's not quite how things are panning out this year. My name is Jenny Cartwright, and my job today is to ask questions of our expert panel, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Thompson, who's a director at travel industry consultancy, the Firebird Partnership. Chris is a former tour operator who now supports founders in a wide range of organisations in both the travel and leisure sectors. Also Sandra Munday from James Cooper Creston. She's a business advisor specialising in dealing with both challenging and distressed financial situations in businesses. And finally, Tom Russell, who also works at James Cooper Creston, who also looks after financially distressed businesses, and in particular, as you can imagine, over the last few years, has had to deal with quite a few in the travel sector. As always, with these webinars, if you have any comments or questions you'd like to ask the panel, please type them either in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll come to those at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to come to Tom first, if I may. We've all seen the impact, and we can probably all imagine the impact the pandemic has had on the travel sector over the last 2 years. Are things finally now starting to look a bit more positive?
Well, Jenny, if you look at the recent press from the start of the year, they certainly think so. If you look at the ski sector, for example, France has recently opened its doors again. And anecdotally, when you speak to businesses in that sector, the phones are ringing off the hook, taking bookings before the end of the season, as you might imagine. EasyJet are reporting a 600% increase on winter sports bookings. Jet2 are claiming a sharp and immediate increase in bookings for French ski holidays. So I think that certainly is taking off, and people are getting away when they can. Looking at the wider market, the press reports earlier this month, Dame Hayes of Hayes Travel reported a boom, and interestingly said that families are spending £500 more per trip as a family than pre-pandemic. And TUI report that bookings have doubled, although this is probably from quite a low level, but certainly there's definite increase in interest and demand. And of course, just this week, the UK has removed the restrictions in relation to testing for vaccinated people. And the recent reports this week show that is also encouraging people. So I would certainly say, yes, it is good news at last, and hopefully sustained good news. And if you look at the markets, BA's parent company and TUI's share price have both gone up about 11% in the last month. And Jet2 is actually up 20% in the last month. So whilst that is a snapshot, it clearly shows that the market is also has increased confidence in the sector going forward. And hopefully that will continue, notwithstanding the pandemic being carrying on and going forward.
Absolutely. I think share price going up, that's always a good sign, isn't it? So we did a survey, and thank you to those of you who are on the webinar today that contributed to that. We got almost 100 responses, which is brilliant. Is that supporting what the press is saying, Tom, or are the media taking us on a merry dance as usual?
Well, I think that it is supporting what we say. To brief, as you can see from the chart, the blue bar, which was last year, as you'd expect, 20% of people didn't go on holiday at all, and the majority of those that did go stayed in the UK. Looking at intentions for this year, so people who booked to intentions, which is the orange bar, only 1% are intending not to go at all, which I think is telling, with 60% looking to travel abroad, and only a relatively small number not staying in the UK. Although, interestingly, there is a relatively large minority, 20% or so, who are undecided. And I would surmise this falls into the wait and see category. If you dig down into the data a little bit more, the people who are suggesting they haven't decided yet are also disproportionately represented in how soon to travel they're going to book. So the majority of those people are looking to book either within a month or certainly within 3 months of travel. So you could surmise that they are waiting and seeing how things unfold before committing to travel. Where that 20% ends up falling will be quite interesting and really make or break the year potentially in terms of travel.
Chris, I'd come to you. Is that what's matching your experience with your clients? Is that what you're seeing as well? Oh, Chris, you're on mute.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key time period has been the last 2 weeks. Things were already picking up. The last 2 weeks, there's been real movement. Echoing what Tom said about sort of ski sector, I have a few ski clients. That's sort of my background, and huge levels of interest. And it's not just people looking; they're booking, and sometimes they're booking in for holidays that are very tight into departure dates, and still paying reasonable prices. It's not about people just picking up bargains. But then, long haul operators we work with, they're seeing pickup of interest, but also pickup of interest, interestingly, not just for this year, but people looking at 2023. So there seems to have just been that kind of relaxation almost of people thinking, okay, we can start looking at things. And again, Tom mentioned EasyJet, they put out their summer figures this morning. They've sold 50% of this summer already, and margins better than pre-pandemic levels. So it's a really encouraging picture at the moment.
Excellent. Touch wood then, that continues. Tom, come back to you, Tom. On the survey, there's a question about the number of holidays people are planning to take. What's that telling us about demand for this year?
Yes, it's almost as if you'd expect in a certain degree. So if you look at pre-pandemic, there's a on the graph there. The majority of people had, a couple, 3 holidays. We defined holidays as 3 or more nights away. So majority had a couple or 3 with a fairly long tail of lucky folk who get away 5-6 times a year. Now, clearly that dropped off last year, as you would expect. Most people only had a holiday, if at all, and a very modest tail of people going away on multiple occasions. But it's much more, the intention anyway is much more back to normal. Most people are intending to do what they did pre-pandemic, it would seem. There's a much longer tail of people looking to go on multiple trips. So I would say it's the intention anyway this year is getting back to normal.
Okay. And I think you mentioned an article at the beginning about people actually paying more for holidays. Is the survey giving any insight into that?
Yeah, well, it is quite interesting. It does. It indicates that intention-wise, 65% of people are looking to pay the same. So they're not necessarily splurging their holiday budget. Now, that doesn't mean they might not go on more cheaper holidays potentially, but the figures from earlier doesn't really reflect that. And of the remaining 35%, there's no real clear breakdown between people wanting to pay more or less. So it's a bit contradictory to what Dame Hayes said about what people are paying, because we're showing intentions rather than the actual price people pay.
Okay. And Chris, from an industry perspective, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think people might want to pay the same, but I suspect they're going to end up paying a bit more. Some of that is cost pressure that's being passed on. There might also be an element of people just deciding to sort of treat themselves if they haven't been away for a couple of years. But across clients that I'm looking at, there's actually quite a similar pattern of quite different businesses that are seeing, average selling prices of 8 to 12% higher than they were in the pre-pandemic period. So that's a very clear pattern for us that we can see across, quite a few different firms.
Okay, thanks for that. And one of the questions we asked on the survey was around the priorities, Tom. Perhaps you could give us a bit of insight into what people thought were most important.
Yes, and of course, if you'd run this question 2 years ago, COVID wouldn't be a response. I wouldn't imagine. So it is clearly something that's probably artificial in some ways. But we asked respondents what their top 3 factors were when considering booking a holiday. And as you might expect, the risk of holiday destinations being introduced, the risk of having a lot of restrictions on return, so having previously being in quarantine, etc., in the UK, and also COVID terms and conditions were effectively the top 3 although financial impact is also fairly high. So it would seem understandably that people are most concerned about their holiday being ruined by restrictions, not being able to go out when they're abroad, being locked down when they are returning, and that is top of people's priority list.
I think the financial protection, although it doesn't, like you say, doesn't quite make the top three, I think that's probably is quite an important consideration. Probably a bit more background on that might be just useful if you could, Tom.
Yeah, and of course financial protection is fairly, in the sector, is fairly wide ranging. So people are concerned about financial protection, so presumably that's getting their money back. They don't seem overly concerned about the financial robustness of the providers, so presumably they're relying on APTA bonding section 75 to allow them to return their monies in the event there's a failure. Now that's an issue if providers are struggling to renew bonds or licenses, etc., and could have an impact on where people book, which we do come to a bit more later. But of course, in terms of companies which are, if you're affected by COVID, it's a bit more complex. Do you want a refund? Do you want a credit note? Do you want to rebook? So I think flexibility in terms of the offering is key. COVID terms are clearly things people are actually reading and looking at before they book. And previously, you wouldn't expect people necessarily to read terms and conditions, but these days that is certainly something I think is top of people's mind.
Definitely. Thanks, Tom. I'm going to come to you next, Sandra, if I may. You would imagine that with everything that we've already talked about, that people would be looking to book with more established and better known operators. Is that what the survey is saying?
Well, you'd have thought, wouldn't you? But actually, no. Really quite surprised at this one, but approximately 60% of our respondents have said that they're looking to arrange their own holidays, sort of on a DIY or sort of Expedia type basis. And if this is something that's reflected more widely than just our survey, then I think tour operators need to think about what their response to this is.
Oh, absolutely. Any thoughts on that to add, Chris?
Yeah, I also think it's really interesting that you've got, in the previous slide, we're looking at this real preference for, financial protection as a really important sort of driver for making a choice. And then you've got this slide that shows this, what people are intending to do is DIY. And I think it raises a lot of issues for tour operators about how they really project the important bits of the terms and conditions, any bonding they have, any security they have. And we've seen a shift for, direct accommodation providers and things, of them changing their cancellation policies, making it far easy to cancel. And tour operators, I think they have kept up. I just don't think they've communicated it as well as they could have done. So they really need to engage with their customer bases, and the terms and conditions are really interesting. When I sort of see the web analytics of a few different travel companies, and there are some days where their T's and C's have been the most visited pages. You think, well, normally nobody goes looking at those. But they need to make sure it's really clear what they can do for people, because I think there's some great offerings, but it's got to be communicated better. Otherwise, there's a risk of people going direct because they see that ability to very quickly and easily get their money back, so up to 14 days out or something like that.
Yeah, certainly, one of the trips I've planned for this year, I've booked my flights and my hotel myself. Flights with BA, and I get a credit note, and I book the hotel, and I can cancel it up to the day before I travel and get my money back. And I don't even have to phone them up. I just do it all online. So I think people quite like that self-service bit as well. So I think that's something that is quite important to people.
And a very similar experience, whilst I have a lot of tour operator clients, I'm ashamed to admit I booked something on Airbnb, and I was just stripping things out if there wasn't easy cancellation up to quite a short period before departure. And I think those things need to be really easy and obvious for people to find, of understanding where they stand. I think there is an opportunity, because tour operator models, particularly people that had committed accommodation and flights, those models have shifted over the last 2 years, and suppliers have agreed to terms they wouldn't have talked about in the past. That just they need to think about how they can pass that on in a way that really appeals to consumers.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, thanks, Chris. Okay, Sandra, back to you again. Given that demand seems to be strong and the market is back open again, have you got some sort of commentary around the challenges that are facing travel businesses at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very difficult time, clearly, and the models that the travel industry used pre-pandemic probably don't hold good now. It's great news that more people want to go abroad and stay in the UK this year, so it should be a good year for the travel industry. But I think building in flexibility to business plans is probably going to be very important, because companies are going to need to react to dynamic and changing situations. Let's hope we don't have another new variant, but we can't entirely rule that out. So budgeting is, as ever, very important. But I think that rolling forecast and keeping an eye every maybe 3 months and just sort of checking that your assumptions for your budgeting is correct. There probably are some specific watch out fors. So our survey said that about 50% of people said that they would look to book their holiday 3 months or less in advance. I think that's quite a big change. So sort of factoring that into your budgeting process is going to be a challenge. I also wonder, and we didn't ask the question in our survey, but whether the type of accommodation that people are looking to book might be different. It might be that people feel a bit nervous depending on how the virus sort of develops about being close to lots of other people. So, you know, your 3-night sort of city centre break might be more adversely impacted than a remote gîte in France, for example. Or people might be prepared to accept the risk of COVID restrictions on a 14-day holiday, but not on a 3-night break. I don't know, Chris, do you have a feeling about that?
Yeah, I think the types of things that people are booking are going to change. And I think cities, the example you used, I think people are going to be a bit wary of cities. And I think the more rural destinations are going to be popular. I think perhaps if you're looking at self-catering units, a shift to self-contained family units. I think all these patterns need to be considered. And one business that I do some work with, typically they've let self-catered units that are 2 or more family units, sort of big villas and chalets. And they look at their web analytics and suddenly everybody's searching for single family units, and that's not really what they have. So now they have to go and find good quality units like that. So the patterns, I think we're only just starting to see. It'll be really interesting what comes out over the next 3 to 6 months. And then the challenge is working out, is it a 1-year blip or is it something that carries on longer term? And the honest answer is we just don't know. But for operators, just keeping a real, as you just said, keeping a real eye on everything and flexing and adapting.
Yeah, and then we sort of also had a little look at travelling with children that aren't double vaccinated, which I think for those aged 12 to 17, that could be, I think you were talking about 1-year blips. This could well be one of those 1-year blips. But if you haven't got a double vaccinated teenager, the ability to go on some of these holidays or the testing regime or the strict restrictions that you might face when you're there could be quite a deterrent. But I think that probably falls into the 1-year sort of blip thing. And then also when you're looking at your budgeting, etc., you need to obviously factor in the vouchers that you gave in the last sort of 18 months to people that couldn't travel and how and when they might cash those in. Also, are people prepared and willing to put down as much of a deposit as previously? Again, that could go to your budgeting. And the relationships with your suppliers, how strong are they now? Are they going to prefer the European or domestic customer to a UK customer, for example? And then there's other things that are sort of a more specific to your business, things like staffing. I mean, I would imagine that lots of businesses unfortunately had to let staff go during the pandemic. And now that things are ramping up again, do you need them back? Or have you changed your model such that it's sort of a much more online offering? And if you have those staff back, what kind of conversations are they having with customers? I mean, over the last 18 months, they'd probably be fairly negative messages that have been coming across, but, you know, it's switching that round to the much more positive message about, you know, the great offerings that you have and the flexibility that's been built into your model. And then if you sort of look at debt levels as well for a lot of businesses, I mean, balance sheets, not just in the travel sector, but balance sheets look very different to the pre-COVID era for lots of businesses. Lots of COVID loans, might be time to pay in there, that you might have arrears of rent with landlords, etc. So there's lots of things to factor in when you're budgeting.
And you mentioned as well, there's issues that are affecting business in general, not just in the travel sector. Is there any other sort of business factors that they probably need to think about as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly having had a fairly benign economy for quite some time, it's now really quite a different picture. So we're all quite well aware of wage inflation that's in the system at the moment, given that we've got nearly full employment in the country. But there's also the national insurance rise, which takes place in April, which will have to be factored into people's forecasts. Fuel costs, you know, they've been hugely impacted recently, and I think that has a disproportionate effect on the travel sector. Interest rates are starting to rise, and again, that will be more impactful for those businesses that are highly geared. I appreciate that the COVID type loans have a set interest rate, but other borrowings that you might have in there. Then we've got inflation that is at record sort of highs at the moment. And we don't quite know how this is going to play out with customer reactions to this. So what impact will this have on discretionary spend if people are feeling a bit squeezed? Will it be the new car or the new kitchen or the redecoration of the house or the holiday that has to feel the effect of the squeeze? We just don't know how people are going to go with that. I would be hopeful that people have thought, well, gosh, we haven't been away for 2 years. Let's at least preserve our holiday. So on the positive side, though, we are close to full employment. So there's lots of people out there earning money and having that ability to potentially have a holiday. And travellers may well have built up a war chest during the COVID era where they've not been able to go out and spend money. So there may be more in the piggy bank for people to spend on a holiday. And then other things that are sort of in the economy at the moment are things like overtrading, which I'm seeing quite a bit of, where people are resource constrained. Specifically, staffing is an issue at the moment for lots of businesses. When I think about the travel sector as well, there may well be difficulties with the availability within the supply chain of accommodation, restaurants, attractions that have had various impacts from COVID. And then looking at sort of cash flow, again, lots of businesses obviously look at their cash flow on a very regular basis. Debt repayment is starting to come into, from COVID loans, is starting to come into play very shortly. Then there's, for the travel sector, voucher redemption. Now in retail, you know, these lovely vouchers that you get given for Christmas, you know, sort of, I don't know, for John Lewis or what have you, only 30% of those ever get redeemed. Now, obviously the travel sector gave out a lot of vouchers for holidays that people couldn't go on last year. And I wonder whether the retail experience will translate in some way to the holiday sector. We don't know. And then there's wage inflation, as we were talking about, the NIC coming through, and the costs of just having to be more flexible as well, Jenny.
Okay. I mean, we've obviously seen from the press there are some tour operators and travel businesses that have failed and stopped trading, but then perhaps resurrected themselves. And obviously, I guess that means they haven't got the debt burden that they previously had. Are those firms going to have a bit of a competitive advantage going forward?
Interesting question, Jenny. I mean, on the face of it, you'd say yes, because it hasn't got the debt burden. But really, I don't think that's necessarily the reality of lots of businesses that have stopped and started again. I mean, they're having to raise funds from scratch. They've suffered staff losses. They've suffered reputational issues. And that's not just with customers, but also with people that they've built bonds with in terms of suppliers. So, a supplier of accommodation to a travel business might be quite wary about supplying a Phoenix company. And then HMRC may well require a bond for VAT, and that could be up to 6 months worth of VAT monies lodged with HMRC that you'd have to do on starting before they'd issue you with the VAT number. And then there's bonding more generally for the travel industry. I think getting a bond after you're sort of in a Phoenix situation will be more challenging. And then, of course, there's the administrative burden of setting up again. It's just not an easy option, Jenny.
No. Okay. Thanks for that, Sandra. I'm going to come to you next, Chris. The insolvency procedure is obviously not an attractive option in most cases. Is the debt burden faced by travel companies, can that impact their ability to meet demand? Is there other things that the operators need to be thinking about, the businesses need to be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges is, as has just been said, balance sheets have taken a hit almost universally. Very few travel businesses have built up their balance sheet during this period. There might be a few exceptions, but not many. And they've got this, these vouchers that are being carried forward. So that's a liability, although it's not shown in that way for some businesses. And I don't think we can look forward to only 30% being redeemed. It's not a book voucher that you lose in the kid's Christmas card. It's something with a significant value that's going to be really front of people's minds. Some weirdly will never reclaim them, but I'd be surprised if it's more than 10%. So I think we can look to those being reclaimed. So people have got to think about their margins, and unsurprisingly for somebody that's been a tour operator for most of their career, I'm a bit of a margin obsessive. And I think people need to think really carefully about what they're selling it in the right way, having the right supplier agreements, and being able to protect those margins so that they can pay down any debt they've accumulated during this period, but also at the same time afford to reinvest in the business. Because one of the things that some of the Phoenix companies might have, and some new entrants, there are new entrants in travel, is they don't have the debt burden, and so they might be able to start from scratch with technology and those sorts of things. And I think existing operators have got to be thinking about how they don't just slip back into doing what they were doing before, but how they build the margin, reinvest, think about new opportunities, because there's been a huge amount of disruption to their plans. Particularly one of the things we look at is owners who've got, perhaps not for quite some time, but one eye on exit, and they've got to think, well, if they still want to do that, how do they build back value in the business? So yeah, a lot of pressures there.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Obviously, Tom talked quite a bit about the survey. Chris, is there any other insights that are worth picking up on at this point?
Well, I think it's worth sort of noting that in this sample, there aren't many people travelling with children. And as we've already mentioned briefly, I think people with children who are in that 12 plus age group, but there's obviously a few in there. That's a tricky area. France and Spain at the moment, which are obviously popular destinations for those sort of short haul summer holidays, both need kids to be double jabbed if they're over 12 at the moment. Looking at the ski season, which is sort of very current for a few people I work with, if children 12 plus are going out to France at the moment, then they need to be doing daily testing. Not only is there a cost to that, but it's just that hassle factor that I think if people aren't already booked, they'll just think, I can't be bothered. And I think the hassle factor is probably more important than cost for some consumers. So as the sort of travel industry people, we need to just strip out as many of the hassles as possible for people. I think going back to this idea of a blip, I think some of these things are 1 year only issues, or we have to hope they are, but it's around thinking about how that affects your model as a tour operator, that cash flow forecasting. And I know everybody's reforecasting all the time, but they're going to have to keep doing that, because the patterns are only just starting to emerge, and I'm very positive, and I think there are opportunities. And I think, going back to what was being said about pressures on consumer spending, I think people will choose the holiday over the new kitchen. They've been staring at their kitchen for 24 months, and yes, I think they want to escape more than they want to do up the kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think people will spend money on doing things rather than buying things, or enough people will. But yeah, need to just lower every single barrier. Think with that consumer head on. What's a potential barrier to somebody spending money, and how can I strip it out or just chip it down a bit?
Okay, thank you. And how are the overseas suppliers viewing the UK travellers at the moment?
I think it's generally positive, but there is a split, and I think there's a danger that some providers on the continent will just say selling to the Brits is a bit of a hassle and I can live without it. And I can definitely think of examples where the domestic market, domestic demand has been very strong. France is a great example. The French kept on traveling within France, they kept on spending money. Benelux countries were available to French suppliers quite quickly. And the on-off nature of the UK was really difficult. So I think there's a job for operators to really engage with those suppliers and explain how they're going to work. But I'm generally encouraged, again, a ski example, but tourist office directors in France, when the UK did open up again, they were really public with their proclamations of this is fantastic news, we welcome back the British, we really value their trade, and they were very, very quick to be very public about that. So again, I'm hopeful, but I think we need to be slightly wary.
Okay. And one of the things Sandra touched on was perhaps that their business models might not quite be fit for purpose in the new world. Has this given businesses an opportunity to reassess what they do and how they do it? And perhaps if you were, say, starting with a clean sheet now, Chris, what sort of areas might you be thinking about?
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity to think sort of, fresh ideas about how to run a business. And I think, operators should be poking every element of their business rather than, as I said, slipping back to what they did before. I think you could argue that some tour operator models were a little bit past their sell-by date anyway, and this has kind of really brought that to home. Staffing is a very interesting one. If you had a team, marketing is an idea that springs to mind. If you had a team of 3 or 4 in-house marketers, actually, do you just need one good person who coordinates external suppliers that you can, be really flexible about? You can manage them tightly, you can manage budgets, and you don't have that commitment of, bodies on the payroll, even if they're not physically sat in an office. I think some of the supplier commercial agreements that have just traditionally always worked in a particular way, there's now a real opportunity to engage with suppliers and say, look, can we work in a different way? Perhaps in a good season, it means the supplier does better than they would have done, but they also share the risk in other periods. So yeah, it's a bit of a broad answer, but it's a kind of poke everything. Just don't assume anything can go back to the way it was. Don't accidentally slip into doing things the way you've always done them. Technology is another, big one. There are so many new possibilities and things that, really strip out the admin burden for tour operators, automate that so that your great staff can be talking to customers and getting excited about selling them holidays rather than dealing with background admin.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. Okay, so we're sort of starting to come towards the end of our presentation. So just a quick reminder, if you have got any questions or any comments you want to make, please type them in the Q&A box for us. And while you're doing that, Tom, I'd just come back to you. Is there anything else worth highlighting from the survey that we've not touched on so far?
Well, there are a few interesting points. One of which, when we asked people what the top 3 things they considered would be important to them when booking, we gave the comments box, and a good number of people mentioned being able to travel with pets. So I presume that's dogs. I presume that's UK holidays, but I think having, and as a dog owner, having the ability to take your pet to your cottage in the UK is an important factor, and you might restrict your market if you don't let them in this day and age. I know people of dog ownership, etc., is on the up anyway, given lockdowns. That's quite interesting. Looking at UK and overseas, clearly last year a lot of people took a holiday in the UK, and the intention is to go abroad this year. And I suppose, is that trend going to stay the same, or will people start to think, well, actually, maybe my second or third holiday I quite liked going in the UK. It was quite easy. I didn't have to pay for parking at the airport, so I might go abroad for 1 or 2 holidays. But I quite like exploring the UK a bit more. So whether the experience of having holidayed in the UK carries forward in the future into the long term, which could obviously impact tour operators, and again, especially city breaks and smaller, shorter trips that someone referred to earlier. Might people go to a cottage in the UK rather than a city break in Europe in the longer term, even notwithstanding COVID? And then we talked about flexibility, and I think, as Chris said, some models are outdated anyway. The move from high street to online was well underway, and that's a trend across the retail sector. We were surprised by the amount of DIY bookings, and I think that really is a challenge. It's just as easy to find a hotel on a high street website and then Google it and book direct. And so that really is something I think that will continue into the long term, and something that tour operators should certainly be aware of in terms of their offering, how they react to that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Chris, any final points that you'd like to make?
I think my sort of final thought, in a way, coming off the back of what Tom said, is that tour operators and travel businesses in general, not just tour operators, just really need to engage with and talk to their customers. And it's been difficult for all the reasons we know. They've been resource tight, they've had to deal with refund issues, they've had some really unpleasant stuff to deal with, and they've had very stretched teams. But what do the customers actually want? What are the shifts in behaviour? What are the shifts in demand? And how best as an organisation, with the sort of skills and expertise that you've got, can you cater to that, even if it's moved dramatically from what you've been doing in the past? Because there will be new opportunities out there. So I think engaging with customers and finding ways of doing that, quickly and efficiently, and then reacting to that is would almost be top of my list for businesses in travel, to really understand what the market that they know, how it's shifted a bit, and what those people might now want.
I think you're right, Chris, in terms of you can only get so much from a web page, and having speaking to someone who can actually tell you about the hotel and the destination, I think is really valuable. So I think that's
getting across that enthusiasm as well, isn't it? And for the customer, it's all part of the excitement of booking a holiday, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got, as travel businesses, generally people are in travel because it really excites them, and because they really know what they're talking about and they love it. So, channel as many resources into that, and getting all the clients enthusiastic as well. And the opportunities are there, and they'll become clear.
Okay, thanks, guys. I've got a question come in around sustainability. Bearing in mind how climate change, sustainability, green agenda is all flavour of the month at the moment, is the pandemic going to have accelerated the impact of that on the travel industry? How do you see things moving forward? Do you see that it's going to change quickly or more quickly, or do you think that the sustainability issues are going to be sort of glossed over? Does that make sense? I'm not making sense very well there, Emma. But do you see that the travel industry will have to change to adapt and to stand up for the sustainability people? I'll come to Sandra, as you're not on mute. I'll come to you first.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. Yeah, I mean, obviously there is a large agenda in relation to sustainability. It's not long since the COP met up in Glasgow. Whether that's going to have an impact on somebody's holiday, I don't know. You might see much more people doing stuff sort of around sort of electric vehicles, as opposed to giving up their opportunity for a holiday. maybe those people would want to make sure that the holiday that they went on, they were doing some good for the local community, be that they spend money in the local community, or be that they spend, I don't know, 12 nights on the beach and 2 nights doing something building a school for a local community or something like that. Afraid, Jenny, I'm not an expert in that area, but maybe Chris has got a view on it.
Well, my view would be that it definitely can't be ignored, and it's going to be a growing trend, and it won't go away. And a few people are already reporting that people are doing sort of fewer, longer trips. And they see that as a way of minimising the environmental impact. I think the point you make about how money's being spent and that going into the local economy, I think is really important. And you see particularly some of the sort of better tour organisations really thinking about those supplier relationships and making sure they're using people that support the economies that they're taking people to. I'm not convinced that stuff has yet spread into kind of a widespread shift in consumer demand. I don't think many people are making their holiday choices on the basis of its kind of environmental impact. A few will be, but it's got to grow. We look at the take-up of electric vehicles recently, and consumer behaviour is shifting, and it's not going to go away. So I don't know either how it's going to play out, but it would be crazy to ignore it.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Tom?
Yes, I think holidays are probably one of the things that's last on people's list when they're looking at lifestyle choices. I think people will still want to go away. Interestingly, will they do, if taxation tries to lead people into decisions, one more expensive, longer trip overseas a year rather than lots of shorter flights is probably better. And that may be where, although contrary to the recent budget, actually, where the taxes on long haul flights might come in to try and change behaviour. So I think it'll be a longer, slower change. Technology will come on board in terms of carbon, I'm sure, and more efficient engines, which will help, but it'll be a longer, slow change. And actually, moving away from carbon, it'll be more about sustainability generally and doing good when you're overseas potentially. But it will happen, but I think it'll be quite slow. One of the last things to move.
One of our attendees has put, I'm all for one longer holiday. I'm with you on that one. Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Thanks, guys. Well, I think unless anyone else is going to quickly type a question in, I think that wraps us up for today. You can see on the screen now our contact details. I think what I would say is the one thing that comes across is you need to talk to people. If you are in this sector and you think you're going to have issues or whatever, there are obviously experts out there who can help you. And that's the secret to everything, really, is to early conversations and talk to people. I'm sure Chris, Sandra or Tom, any of them will be happy to have a conversation with you about any of the things that we've discussed today. So all it remains for me to thank our panellists. Thank you, Sandra, Tom, and thank you, Chris. Thank you to you, our attendees, for joining us this morning. Hope you found it useful. Keep in touch and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.